The
And
waves
that is
crashed
why I
against the
truly
rocky
believe
shoreline,
we must
sending
act
sprays of
now
salt water into
before
the
it's too
crisp
late.
Maine air.
We owe
Richard
them that
Anderson sat
much.
alone on the
You
weathered
know, you
bench at
spend
the
your
end of the
whole life
pier,
chasing
his
one thing,
calloused hands
and then you
resting on knees
realize
that had
the
carried the
real
weight of
treasure
decades of
was
labor.
right there in front of you
At
the whole time.
68, his face bore
It
the
all
map of a
started
life
back in
lived
that
through
winter of
sacrifice
'68.
and hard
We
work.
didn't have much,
Each
but
line
we
etched
had
by
each other,
years under
and
the
that made
sun,
all the difference in
each
the
crease
world.
around his eyes carved by both laughter and tears. Behind him stood his small cottage, modest but his own. Before him stretched the vast Atlantic, its endless horizon a reminder of how far he had come. As the seagulls cried overhead, Richard closed his eyes and allowed his mind to drift back to where it all began. The memory of that day still burned bright in his mind even after all these years. The sterile hospital room, the antiseptic smell that couldn't mask the scent of impending loss. Margaret's hand, once strong and vibrant, now thin and frail in his own. Her voice barely above a whisper made him lean closer to catch her final words. "Promise me you'll give Emily everything we dreamed of. Promise me she'll never know the hardship we faced." "I promise," he had said, his voice breaking. "With everything I have, I promise." Sometimes the heaviest burdens come wrapped in the purest love. That promise would shape every decision he would make for decades to come. Emily had been just 8 years old when cancer took her mother. A bright child with Margaret's eyes and smile, she clung to Richard in those first dark months, her small body racked with sobs in the night. He would hold her, rock her, telling stories of her mother until she drifted to sleep, only then allowing his own tears to fall. By day, Richard worked as a construction foreman, leaving before dawn and returning after dark. But the bills from Margaret's treatment kept coming, threatening to drown them both. One job wasn't enough. Soon he added night security shifts at a local warehouse, catching fragments of sleep when he could, often in his truck between busties. His own parents had known poverty had raised him in it, and he was determined that Emily would never experience the same. Never know the shame of worn-out clothes or the gnawing pain of hunger. Never feel the cold seep through thin walls in winter. Every sacrifice was worth it to see her grow strong and confident, unburdened by need. Dinner became a ritual, the one time each day they would sit together. Richard would serve Emily proper meals with meat and vegetables, while his own plate often held little more than bread and whatever remained. When she asked why he wasn't eating more, he'd smile and say, "I had a big lunch today, sweetheart." The lie came easily when it was wrapped in love. On Saturdays, his only day off, he would take Emily to the public library. She devoured books with an insatiable hunger that made his heart swell with pride. Her teachers noticed her brightness too, calling her exceptional gifted. Each commendation was a balm to Richard's exhaustion, confirmation that his sacrifices were bearing fruit. "Daddy," she asked one night as he tucked her in, "are we poor?" The question caught him off guard. "Why do you ask that, Emily?" "Jenny at school said we must be poor because I never get new clothes, just her hand-me-downs." Richard sat on the edge of her bed, choosing his words carefully. "We have everything we need, sweetheart. And we have something that Jenny might not have. We know what matters most." "What's that?" "Each other and memories of your mom. Those are worth more than any new clothes." She seemed satisfied with his answer, but the question haunted him. That night, after she was asleep, Richard sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper, calculating and recalculating their finances. There had to be a way to give her more. What began that night was a 15-year plan. Richard started taking on extra weekend jobs, squirreling away every extra dollar. He lived on coffee and determination, working through exhaustion, through illness, through the bone-deep wearinesses that never quite left him. Emily, for her part, seemed to understand more than he gave her credit for. Each morning he would find a small note tucked under his pillow or in his lunchbox. "Thank you for working so hard," they would say, or "I love you more than the stars." Each note he saved in a small wooden box, pulling them out on his darkest days as a reminder of what he was fighting for. By Emily's 12th birthday, Richard had saved enough for a small plot of land in a good school district outside of Boston. It wasn't much, just an acre with a view of distant hills, but it was theirs. He took her there on a crisp autumn day, watching her race across the tall grass, her laughter carried on the wind. "What do you think, Em?" he called out. "Someday we'll build a house here. A proper house with your own room and a big kitchen for Sunday dinners." She had turned to him, then her face alight with joy. "Promise, with everything I have, He echoed the words he'd spoken to Margaret. 3 more years of saving followed before Richard could begin construction. By then, Emily was 15, caught in the tumult of adolescence. She had friends introduced a life that increasingly took her away from home. But on weekends, she would still come with him to the land watching as he measured and staked out where their future home would stand. Richard built that house with his own hands. Every weekend, every holiday, every spare hour was devoted to transforming lumber and nails into a home. He called in favors from fellow construction workers who came to help raise walls or lay shingles. Emily would bring them lemonade in the summer and hot cocoa in the winter, proudly telling anyone who would listen, "My dad is building this all by himself." It took 3 years. 3 years of backbreaking labor on top of his regular work. 3 years of falling asleep with sawdust in his hair and waking with muscles screaming in protest. But when it was done, it stood as a testament to his love and determination, a 2-story colonial with 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a front porch perfect for watching sunsets. The day they moved in, Emily, now 18 and preparing for college, walked through each room in silent wonder. Finally, she turned to Richard, tears streaming down her face. "How did you do this, Dad? How did you manage all of this?" Richard, overwhelmed by emotion himself, simply pulled her into a tight embrace. "One day at a time, Em. Just one day at a time." That night, as Richard lay in his new bedroom, the smallest one, as he'd insisted Emily take the master suite, he felt Margaret's presence stronger than he had in years. "I kept my promise," he whispered to the darkness. "I gave her everything we dreamed of." And the acceptance letter from Northeastern University came the following spring. Emily, with her outstanding grades and volunteer work, had not only been admitted, but offered a substantial scholarship. It wasn't a full ride, those were rare, but combined with Richard's savings, it would be enough to see her through without debt. The day of her college graduation was the proudest of Richard's life. Watching Emily walk across that stage, her honor cords swinging with each confident step, he felt a sense of completion. Margaret would have been so proud. Against all odds, he had fulfilled his promise. Emily looked radiant in her cap and gown, her face shining with accomplishment as she searched the crowd and found his eyes. In that moment, all the years of exhaustion, all the missed meals and sleepless nights, all the lonely hours, they all crystallized into perfect, shimmering joy. At the celebration dinner afterwards, surrounded by Emily's friends and their parents, Richard watched his daughter with quiet pride. She had blossomed into a remarkable young woman, intelligent, compassionate, driven. Everything he and Margaret had dreamed she would become. "Dad," Emily said, raising her glass in a toast, "I wouldn't be here without you. Everything I am, everything I've accomplished, it's because you never gave up on me." The room erupted in applause, and Richard felt his cheeks flush with embarrassment and pride. Later, as they drove home together, Emily turned to him with unexpected seriousness. "I know what you did for me all these years, Dad, the sacrifices you made. I know you went without so I could have what I needed." Richard kept his eyes on the road, surprised by the tightness in his throat. "You weren't supposed to notice that part." "I noticed everything. Those nights you thought I was asleep, but I heard you counting pennies at the kitchen table. The way you always said you weren't hungry when there wasn't enough food, I saw it all." "Em, no, let me finish. I'm going to make you proud, Dad. I'm going to make sure every sacrifice was worth it. You'll see." Richard reached across and squeezed her hand. "You already have, sweetheart. You already have." Life took on a new rhythm after Emily's graduation. She secured a position at a prestigious financial firm in Boston, her natural aptitude for numbers and strategy quickly earning her recognition. Richard continued his work in construction, though he finally allowed himself to reduce his hours, his body no longer able to sustain the punishing schedule he'd maintained for so many years. It was at a company function that Emily met Gregory Hayes, a charming investment analyst with ambition that matched her own. Richard noticed the spark between them, immediately recognizing in Greg's attentive gaze the same look he had once given Margaret. Their courtship was swift and tense. Within a year, Greg had proposed presenting Emily with a diamond ring that made Richard wince internally at what it must have cost. But Emily was radiant with happiness, and that was all that mattered to him. As father of the bride, Richard threw himself into wedding preparations with the same determination he'd applied to building their home. No expense was spared, though it meant dipping deeply into his retirement savings. The day itself was perfect. Emily, a vision in white, Greg, handsome and proud beside her. During the reception, Richard slipped away to his study, returning with a sealed envelope. He found the newlyweds sharing a quiet moment away from their guests. "I have something for you both," he said, handing Emily the envelope. Inside was the deed to the house transferred to Emily's name. "Dad, no," she gasped. "We can't accept this. It was always meant to be yours, Em. I built it for you." Greg studied the document with the careful eye of a financial professional. "This is incredibly generous, Richard, but where will you live?" "I've kept the in-law suite over the garage for myself. It's more than enough space for one old man. This way, you two can start your life together without the burden of a mortgage." Emily threw her arms around him, sobbing into his shoulder. "I don't deserve you, Dad. You deserve everything good in this world, sweetheart. Everything." What Richard didn't mention, what he made sure was explained in the fine print that neither Emily nor Greg read carefully, was the special trust arrangement he'd established with his lawyer. The house was indeed Emily's, but with specific conditions. Richard retained certain rights, including the nuclear option, the ability to sell in case of severe breach of family trust. It was a safeguard he never imagined needing, a legal footnote that seemed overly cautious at the time. "You're the lawyer, James," he had said to his old friend who handled the paperwork. "Tell me I'm being paranoid." James Morrison, who had seen the aftermath of enough family disputes to fill several lifetimes, had simply shrugged. "It's like insurance, Rich. You hope you never need it, but you'll be damn glad it's there if you do." The early years of Emily and Greg's marriage were happy ones. They both thrived in their careers, Emily climbing steadily through the ranks at her firm, while Greg made a name for himself in investment banking. Richard settled comfortably into his role as the doting father-in-law and eventually grandfather when their son Michael was born. But time changes all things, and success often exacts its own price. The first signs were subtle. Emily began canceling their standing Sunday dinners, citing work emergencies, or social obligations that couldn't be rescheduled. When they did gather, her attention was frequently elsewhere, on her phone, checking emails, making quick calls that couldn't wait. "The Henderson account is worth millions, Dad," she would explain, barely looking up from her screen. "I can't just ignore it because it's dinner time." Greg's career took a darker turn. Pressure to deliver increasingly unrealistic returns led to ethical corners, cut then rules bent, and finally lines crossed. The scandal broke quietly. At first, internal investigations whispered concerns, but soon exploded into public view. Greg was forced to resign, his professional reputation in tatters. The financial strain was immediate and severe. Their lavish lifestyle, maintained on the expectation of ever-increasing incomes, suddenly became untenable. Emily, now the sole breadwinner, faced mounting pressure at work and at home. Greg, depressed and drinking heavily, became a shadow of the confident man Richard had once welcomed into the family. It was during this period that Richard began to notice the change in how Emily spoke to him. The respectful, loving tone gradually gave way to impatience, then irritation, and finally barely disguised contempt. "Dad, you simply don't understand how the modern world works," she snapped one evening when he suggested they consider downsizing to reduce financial pressure. "We can't just move to some small house in the suburbs. Perception matters in my industry. If clients think I'm struggling, they'll pull their business." Richard, stunned by her tone, fell silent. That night, he lay awake in his modest suite above the garage, turning the interaction over in his mind. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the world had changed too much, moved too fast, and left him behind. The pattern continued. At dinner parties with their remaining friends, Emily would cut Richard off mid-sentence, rolling her eyes at his outdated perspectives. "Dad still thinks a firm handshake and looking someone in the eye is all it takes to make a deal." She would laugh, encouraging others to join in her mockery. Richard began to feel invisible in the house he had built with his own hands. The warm, loving daughter who had once left notes under his pillow was gone, replaced by a stranger who viewed him as an inconvenience, an embarrassment, a relic. One afternoon, returning early from a doctor's appointment, Richard overheard Emily and her friend Stephanie talking in the kitchen. He paused in the hallway, not intending to eavesdrop, but then heard his name. "Have to do something about your debt deed," Stephanie was saying. "My mother moved into Oakwood Retirement Community last year, and they have openings." I know," Emily sighed. "It's just complicated. The house is technically in my name, but he acts like he still owns the place. always fixing things without asking, offering opinions on renovations. He built it right. Maybe that's why he can't let go. That was decades ago. Times change. We need to update this place if we're ever going to sell it and move to Beacon Hill. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. They were planning to sell the house, his house, and move him into a retirement home, without even discussing it with him. The real problem, Emily continued, her voice lowered, is that I can't afford both the new house and the retirement home fees. Not with Greg still unemployed. Doesn't your dad have savings? A bitter laugh. He spent everything on this house and my education. There's nothing left. He's going to be completely dependent on us. The weight of those words hit Richard like a physical blow. After everything he had sacrificed, everything he had built, he was now viewed as nothing more than a financial burden, an old man who had outlived his usefulness. He retreated silently to his rooms, his mind reeling. That night, he pulled out the wooden box containing Emily's childhood notes. "Thank you for working so hard," they read. "I love you more than the stars." The contrast between those heartfelt words and the cold dismissal he had just overheard was almost unbearable. In the weeks that followed, Richard became acutely aware of how he was being gradually edged out of family decisions, treated as if his opinions no longer mattered, his presence merely tolerated. At dinner, Emily would serve him last, sometimes forgetting his dietary restrictions. During family discussions, his input was ignored or brushed aside with condescending patience. "Dad, we've moved past that way of thinking," became Emily's constant refrain, dismissing decades of his hard-earned wisdom in a single sentence. The neighbors noticed the change as well. Martha Dawson, a kind widow who had moved in next door after her husband's passing, often stopped Richard for conversations when he was working in the garden. "Emily seems very busy these days," she remarked one afternoon, her tone carefully neutral. "Her career is demanding," Richard replied automatically, the excuse worn smooth with repetition. Martha's eyes, warm and perceptive, held his gaze. "That doesn't give anyone the right to treat their father like a piece of furniture." Her blunt assessment startled a laugh out of him, the first genuine one in months. "Is it that obvious? To anyone paying attention?" She paused, then added gently, "My Harold always said respect isn't an optional extra in a family. It's the foundation everything else is built on." Those words stayed with Richard, echoing in his mind during sleepless nights. Respect, the foundation everything else is built on. Like the foundation of a house, if it crumbles, nothing above can stand for long. The neighborhood block party was Emily's idea, or rather her attempt to impress a potential client who lived several doors down. The backyard was transformed with catered food, hired servers, and a bar featuring top-shelf liquor. Richard, relegated to the role of silent observer, watched as Emily worked the crowd, her professional charm on full display. Greg, sober for the occasion, stood by her side, playing the role of supportive husband while nursing a glass of sparkling water. Their son Michael, now 12 and increasingly distant, remained glued to his phone in a corner of the yard. Richard found himself drawn to a weathered Adirondack chair at the edge of the property. It had been one of the first pieces of furniture he'd built for the house, its arms worn smooth by years of use. Recently, one of the arms had splintered, and he had carefully repaired it that morning. "Mr. Anderson," Martha greeted him, settling into the matching chair beside his. "Quite a production your daughter has put together." "She's always been thorough," he replied, watching Emily laugh animatedly at something the potential client said. "I noticed you fixed the chair. Good work." "Just a simple repair, nothing special." Their conversation was interrupted by Emily's approach, her professional smile faltering, as she noticed Richard sitting in the repaired chair. "Dad, what are you doing?" she hissed, low enough that nearby guests couldn't hear, but loud enough that Martha tensed beside him. "I told Greg to throw these old chairs away. The new patio furniture is being delivered next week." Richard blinked, confused. "The arm was just loose, Em. I fixed it this morning." "That's not the point." Her voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby guests. "These don't match the aesthetic we're going for. I specifically asked you not to touch anything before the party." "I don't recall that conversation," Richard said, carefully aware of Martha's presence and the attention they were beginning to attract. Emily's eyes flashed with irritation. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. You never listen anymore. Your memory is—" "My memory is fine, Emily," Richard interrupted, an edge entering his voice. You never mentioned the chairs. Several guests had stopped their conversations, now watching the exchange with uncomfortable interest. Greg approached cautiously, placing a hand on Emily's arm. "Maybe we should discuss this later, honey," he murmured. She shook off his hand. "No, we need to be clear about this. Dad, I appreciate that you built this house, but things change. We need to update, modernize. These old chairs, the constant repairs, the outdated fixtures, none of it works for our lifestyle anymore." Richard stood slowly, dignity straightening his spine. "I was just trying to help." "Well, you're not helping," Emily's control finally snapped, her voice rising to a near shout. "You're making things worse. Do you think I want potential clients seeing these ancient chairs? Do you think it helps my image to have my elderly father puttering around fixing things that should be replaced?" A shocked silence fell over the yard. Neighbors froze mid-conversation, glasses halted halfway to lips. "Emily," Richard said quietly, "I think you should lower your voice." It happened so fast. Emily's hand swung up and then connected with Richard's cheek, the crack of the slap echoing in the sudden stillness. Richard's head jerked sideways from the force of the blow, his eyes widening in shock. "Don't tell me what to do in my own house." Emily's words cut through the silence like a knife. "This is my house, not yours. You're living here on my charity, so don't you dare tell me what I can and cannot do." Richard stood perfectly still, one hand slowly rising to touch his reddening cheek. The pain was nothing compared to the crushing weight of humiliation that pressed down on him. Around them, neighbors stared in horror, though he caught a few younger guests exchanging smirks. Martha Dawson had risen to her feet, her face a mask of outrage. "Emily Hayes," she exclaimed, "have you lost your mind?" Emily turned on her, anger still burning bright. "Stay out of this, Martha. This is family business. It became everyone's business when you struck your father in front of the entire neighborhood." Martha replied, her voice steady with a conviction. Richard finally found his voice. "It's all right, Martha." He lowered his hand from his face, straightened his shoulders, and looked his daughter directly in the eyes. Without another word, he turned and walked with measured steps toward the garage apartment, his back straight, his dignity the only shield he had left. Behind him, he heard the murmur of conversations, resuming the awkward attempts to pretend nothing had happened. But something fundamental had broken in that moment, something that all his years of sacrifice and love had built shattered with a single blow. In his apartment, Richard sat on the edge of his bed, the events of the afternoon playing on endless repeat in his mind. The slap itself was shocking, yes, but it was the contempt behind it that cut deepest. The public humiliation, the dismissal of everything he had given. For the first time in decades, Richard allowed himself to weep, not the quiet tears he had shed at Margaret's passing, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a well of pain he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. He wept for the daughter he had raised with such love, now transformed into someone he barely recognized. He wept for Margaret, who had been spared seeing what had become of their family. Most of all, he wept for himself, for the realization that all his sacrifices had led to this moment of utter rejection. As darkness fell, his tears finally spent. Richard sat in silence, watching the lights of the neighborhood through his window. A strange calm settled over him. The decision, when it came, didn't feel like a choice made in anger or hurt. It felt like the inevitable conclusion to a story that had been unfolding for years. Respect was the foundation everything was built on. And once that foundation crumbled, nothing above could stand. Richard Anderson would not beg for the respect he had earned through a lifetime of sacrifice. He would not plead for kindness from the daughter he had given everything to. No, he would act, and his action would speak louder than any words ever could. Sleep eluded Richard that night. As darkness enveloped his apartment, he sat in his worn armchair by the window, staring out at the neighborhood he had chosen so carefully for Emily all those years ago. The stinging on his cheek had subsided, but the deeper wound, the one that had torn open his heart, throbbed with an intensity that made breathing difficult. In the quiet solitude of night, Richard's mind traveled back through the years like a man retracing his steps through a familiar forest. Each memory, each sacrifice, each moment of joy and hardship unfurled before him with crystalline clarity. The double shifts he'd worked when Emily needed braces. The promotions he'd declined because they would have meant moving during her senior year. The retirement fund he'd depleted to pay for her wedding. All given freely without expectation of repayment. But he had expected one thing: respect. Not gratitude, not worship, just basic human dignity. the kind any father deserved from the child he had raised with such devotion. Around 3 in the morning, Richard rose from his chair and opened the small cedar box he kept on his bedside table. Inside lay the childhood notes from Emily, yellowed with age, but preserved with care. He spread them on the bed, these paper fragments of a daughter's love. To the best daddy in the world. Thank you for working so hard. I love you more than chocolate cake. Each one a testament to a relationship that now felt like a distant dream. As dawn broke, Richard had not slept, but something had shifted within him. The crushing pain had hardened into resolve. The humiliation had transformed into clarity. He would not raise his voice. He would not plead. He would not engage in dramatic confrontation. Richard Anderson had spent a lifetime building things with careful planning and precise execution. He would approach this situation no differently. Dignity isn't something others can take from you, he whispered to himself, echoing words his own father had spoken decades ago. It's something you stand up and protect. The words resonated in the quiet room, and with them came a decision. Not born of anger, though anger would have been justified. Not born of vengeance, though many would have sought it. This decision was born of the simple, undeniable truth that some actions must have consequences, or they would surely be repeated. Richard showered and dressed with deliberate care, choosing his best shirt and the tie Emily had given him for Christmas years ago. The irony wasn't lost on him. He made coffee, ate a simple breakfast, and then reached for his phone. The number he dialed was one he hadn't called in some time, but James Morrison answered on the third ring, his voice gravelly with sleep. Rich, everything. Okay, it's not even 7. I need to see you, James. Today, if possible. There must have been something in his tone that brooked no argument, because James simply said, my office, 9 o'clock. The law offices of Morrison and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a modest building in downtown Boston. Richard had known James since they were boys growing up in the same working-class neighborhood. While Richard had followed his father into construction, James had worked his way through law school, becoming the first in his family to earn a professional degree. Despite their different paths, their friendship had endured. James was waiting when Richard arrived, concern evident in the deep furrows of his brow. You look like hell, Rich. What happened? Richard sat heavily in the chair across from James's desk. For a moment, he couldn't speak, the events of the previous day catching in his throat. Then slowly he told James everything. The gradual change in Emily's behavior, the overheard conversation about selling the house, the public humiliation at the party, the slap that had shattered something fundamental between father and daughter. James listened without interruption, his expression darkening as the story unfolded. When Richard finished, a heavy silence filled the office. I need to know, Richard finally said, his voice steady, despite the emotion churning beneath, if that trust provision we included when I transferred the house to Emily is still valid. James opened a drawer, extracting a folder with Richard's name on it. The severe breach of family trust clause. It's still there. We were very careful with the language. He skimmed the document, refreshing his memory. Physical assault would certainly qualify as a severe breach. Would her word against mine be enough in court? James looked up sharply. You're actually thinking of invoking it, Rich. This is your daughter we're talking about. I'm aware of that, James. Richard's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. I've given that girl everything. Everything. And yesterday she slapped me in front of the entire neighborhood and told me I was living on her charity. This isn't a heated argument or a misunderstanding. This is a fundamental breakdown of respect. James studied his old friend, noting the resolve in his eyes. You'd need evidence. Your testimony alone might not be enough, especially against someone like Emily, who I imagine would hire aggressive representation. What kind of evidence? Witnesses would help. Proof of the assault would be ideal. Richard thought of Martha Dawson, her outrage at Emily's behavior. There was a neighbor who saw everything. She confronted Emily immediately afterward. That's a start, but if you're really considering this, Rich, I need to be clear about what it means. You'd be legally forcing the sale of your daughter's home. It would devastate her financially, not to mention emotionally. This isn't something you can undo once it's done. Richard nodded slowly. I understand. Because from where I'm sitting, this looks like the nuclear option. Are you sure there's no other way to address this? Family counseling? Perhaps a heart-to-heart conversation when tempers have cooled? Those might be options if Emily saw a problem with her behavior. But she doesn't, James. She believes she was justified. She believes I deserved it. Richard leaned forward, his voice dropping. I built that house for her, with these hands. He held them up calloused and worn from decades of labor. I poured every ounce of love I had into those walls, and now she uses it as a weapon against me. James sighed heavily. I'll need to review the trust documents more carefully, make sure everything is in order. And we'd need to build a stronger case. Your neighbor's testimony would help, but more evidence would be better. As if on cue, Richard's phone chimed with an incoming message. It was from Martha Dawson. Richard, I've been worried about you since yesterday. Please call me when you can. I think you should know my security camera captured everything. Greg installed it last year when there were break-ins in the neighborhood. I've saved the footage. Richard showed the message to James, whose eyebrows rose significantly. Well, that changes things. Video evidence would make this nearly ironclad. Then we proceed. Richard's decision was firm. Let me play devil's advocate for a moment, James said. What if Emily apologizes? What if she realizes she crossed a line and tries to make amends? Richard considered this, trying to imagine a scenario where Emily came to him with genuine remorse. The Emily he had raised would have done so immediately. The woman who had slapped him yesterday would not. I've spent my life forgiving Emily's mistakes, James. I've overlooked the growing disrespect, the dismissive attitude, the way she speaks about me to others as if I'm a burden rather than her father. I've made excuses for her behavior, blamed it on stress or her troubled marriage. But this crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. He met his friend's gaze steadily. Some lessons can only be taught through consequences. James studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I'll start the preparations. But Rich, take a few days to think it over. Make sure this is really what you want. It isn't what I want, Richard replied quietly. It's what needs to be done. As he left James's office, Richard felt a strange lightness. Not happiness. There was no joy to be found in this decision, but clarity. For too long, he had allowed himself to be diminished in the name of fatherly love. That ended now. Richard's next stop was Martha Dawson's home. The silver-haired widow welcomed him with genuine concern, ushering him into a living room decorated with photos of her late husband and their children. Richard, I've been so worried. Are you all right? What Emily did was inexcusable. I'm managing, Martha. Thank you for your message about the security footage. Yes, of course. Martha moved to a small desk in the corner where a laptop sat. Greg insisted on installing these cameras after the Petersons' house was broken into. I barely know how to use the system, but I did figure out how to save this clip. She turned the screen toward Richard. I hope you don't mind that I watched it. I wanted to make sure it captured everything clearly. Richard steeled himself as Martha pressed play. The footage was high quality, showing the backyard from an elevated angle. He could see himself sitting in the Adirondack chair, Martha joining him. Then Emily approaching, the argument escalating, and finally the slap clear as Dave followed by Emily's tirade. The audio was surprisingly good, capturing every word of her humiliating speech. Watching it was like experiencing the moment all over again. Richard felt his chest tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. This is very clear evidence, Martha. May I ask why you're willing to help me with this? Martha closed the laptop, her expression serious. My Harold was a lot like you, Richard. A man who worked with his hands, built things that lasted, valued respect above all else. If one of our children had treated him the way Emily treated you yesterday, she shook her head. Let's just say I understand why you might need this footage. I haven't decided what I'll do with it yet, Richard said, though this wasn't entirely true. Whatever you decide, I support you. Martha squeezed his arm gently. That girl needs to learn that actions have consequences, especially when those actions hurt someone who has given her everything. Richard nodded, grateful for her understanding. Would you be willing to provide a statement about what you witnessed if it came to that? Absolutely. Just let me know what you need. As he left Martha's house with a copy of the video, Richard felt the weight of his decision pressing on him. He was setting in motion something that would fundamentally alter his relationship with Emily forever. Was he prepared for that? The answer came as he walked past a neighborhood park where families gathered on the pleasant afternoon. A father was teaching his young daughter to ride a bike, his hand steady on the seat as she pedaled nervously. I've got you, the man was saying. I won't let you fall. The scene transported Richard back to a similar day with Emily, her pigtails flying in the wind as she had finally found her balance and ridden away from him, triumphant and proud. That had been his job as a father, to hold her steady until she could stand on her own, to teach her how to navigate the world with confidence and kindness. Somewhere along the way, he had failed to teach her about respect. Perhaps it wasn't too late for that lesson. Perhaps this painful consequence would help her understand what all his words had failed to convey. With renewed resolve, Richard returned to his apartment. Over the next few days, he avoided Emily, using the side entrance to his rooms and timing his comings and goings when he knew she would be at work. He noted with a mixture of sadness and validation that she made no attempt to check on him or apologize. On the fourth day after the incident, James called. "I've reviewed everything, Rich. The trust provision is solid. With the video evidence and witness testimony, we have a strong case. I've also done some preliminary research on potential buyers. Already just exploring options. There's a development company that's been buying properties in that neighborhood. They're offering above market value because they're planning luxury townhomes. The location of your house, Emily's house, would be ideal for them." The reality of what they were discussing hit Richard anew. This wasn't just about making a point or teaching a lesson. This was about selling the house he had built with his own hands, the place where he had raised his daughter, the home filled with memories of Margaret. "Rich, are you still there?" "I'm here, James. It's just hitting me what this really means. It's not too late to reconsider. We haven't filed anything yet." Richard closed his eyes, seeing again the contempt on Emily's face as she had slapped him, hearing her voice declaring that he lived on her charity, remembering the conversation about shipping him off to a retirement home so she could sell the house and move to Beacon Hill. "No," he said finally, "we proceed as planned. Set up a meeting with the development company." The following week was a blur of legal consultations and discreet meetings. The development company, Meridian Properties, expressed immediate interest when James reached out. Their representative, a polished woman named Vanessa Chen, reviewed the property details with obvious approval. "This location is perfect for what we're planning," she told Richard during their meeting. "We've acquired several adjacent properties already. Or rather your daughter's house would complete the parcel we need." "And you understand the delicate nature of this situation," James interjected. Vanessa nodded. "Complete discretion is assured. We deal with sensitive family matters more often than you might think." She slid a document across the table. "Here's our initial offer. As you can see, it's 30% above current market value, given the strategic importance of this particular property to our development plans." Richard glanced at the figure and felt momentarily lightheaded. The amount was substantial, far more than he had anticipated, enough to secure his future and then some. "The timeline would be aggressive," Vanessa continued. "We'd need to close within 30 days to keep our project on schedule." James looked at Richard. "That's very fast." "It's perfect," Richard said quietly. "The sooner this is resolved, the better." As they worked through the details, Richard felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were observing someone else's life unfolding. Was he really doing this, selling the house he had built for Emily? The home where they had shared so many memories? Yes, he was, because that home had become a prison of disrespect and humiliation. Because the daughter who now owned it had forgotten the meaning of family and dignity. Because some lessons could only be learned through loss. The paperwork was prepared with meticulous care. James insisted on triple-checking every detail to ensure there could be no legal challenges later. The trust provision was clear: in cases of severe breach of family trust, specifically including physical assault, Richard retained the right to sell the property. The video evidence from Martha's security camera provided irrefutable proof of such a breach. 10 days after the incident at the party, everything was ready. The contracts were drawn up, the buyer was prepared, and all legal bases were covered. All that remained was to inform Emily. Richard chose a Tuesday afternoon for the confrontation. He knew Emily would be working from home that day. She always did on Tuesdays, to accommodate client calls from Europe. Greg would be at a job interview, and Michael would be at soccer practice. They would have the house to themselves. That morning, Richard dressed with deliberate care. Not in his Sunday best, this was not a celebration, but in clean, pressed clothes that conveyed respect for the gravity of the occasion. He checked his reflection in the mirror, noting how much older he looked than he had just 2 weeks ago. Grief had carved new lines into his face, deep in the shadows beneath his eyes. He gathered the documents James had prepared, placing them in a leather portfolio Margaret had given him for his 50th birthday. Then he sat on the edge of his bed, gathering his thoughts and his courage. At precisely 2 o'clock, Richard descended from his apartment and walked to the main house. He didn't knock, he still had a key, and this conversation was not one to be had on a doorstep. He found Emily in the kitchen, laptop open before her phone pressed to her ear as she discussed investment strategies with someone named Carson. She glanced up when he entered, surprise flickering across her face. Since the incident, they had successfully avoided each other, a tacit agreement to pretend nothing had happened. "Carson, let me call you back in 20 minutes, she said, ending the call. "Dad, is everything okay?" The casual tone, the complete absence of acknowledgement or apology for what had transpired between them reinforced Richard's resolve. "We need to talk, Emily." Something in his voice must have signaled the seriousness of the moment because she closed her laptop and gave him her full attention. "What's this about?" Richard placed the leather portfolio on the kitchen island between them and withdrew the documents. "The house has been sold," he said simply. "You have 30 days to vacate." Emily stared at him, uncomprehending. Then she laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "Very funny, Dad. What is this really about?" Richard slid the documents toward her. "It's not a joke, Emily. The house has been sold to Meridian Properties. They're planning to develop this entire block into luxury townhomes. The sale is final." Emily's face drained of color as she scanned the paperwork, her professional training allowing her to quickly grasp the essential points. "This is impossible. The house is in my name. You can't sell what you don't own." "Page 4, paragraph 3, Richard said calmly. "The trust provision regarding severe breach of family trust. When I transferred the house to you, this clause was included specifically to protect my interests in case of certain scenarios, including physical assault." "Physical assault?" Emily's voice rose in indignation. "What are you talking about?" In answer, Richard withdrew a tablet from the portfolio and played Martha's security footage. The sounds of the party filled the kitchen, followed by their argument, and then the unmistakable crack of Emily's hand against his cheek. Her voice harsh and contemptuous. "Don't tell me what to do in my own house. This is my house, not yours. You're living here on my charity, so don't you dare tell me what I can and cannot do." Emily watched in horror, her hand rising unconsciously to cover her mouth. When the clip ended, she looked up at Richard, her expression a mixture of shock, anger, and the first flickers of fear. "You slapped me in front of our neighbors," Richard said, his voice steady. "You humiliated me in the home I built with my own hands. You told me I was living on your charity. Those actions have consequences, Emily." "This is insane," she whispered. "You're selling our home because of one mistake, one moment when I lost my temper." "It wasn't one moment, and you know it." Richard maintained his calm demeanor, though his heart was breaking anew at the realization that even now she didn't truly understand. It was the culmination of years of growing disrespect. "It was you planning to sell this house and put me in a retirement home without even discussing it with me. It was you treating me like a burden rather than your father." Emily's shock was giving way to panic. "Dad, you can't do this. This is our home. Where are we supposed to go? What about Michael, his school, his friends?" "You'll receive 70% of the proceeds from the sale," Richard explained. "It's more than enough to purchase a suitable home in a good school district. The remaining 30% will secure my future so that I'll never be dependent on you, as you so eloquently put it to Stephanie." Emily's eyes widened at the reference to that private conversation. "You were eavesdropping on me. I overheard you discussing my future as if I weren't a person with feelings and dignity." Richard's composure slipped slightly, the hurt showing through. "I heard my daughter, whom I have loved and sacrificed for all my life, speak of me as nothing but a financial burden." Tears filled Emily's eyes, whether from genuine remorse or the shock of her current circumstances, Richard couldn't tell. "Dad, please. We can work this out. I'm sorry about what happened at the party. I was stressed, overwhelmed with work and Greg's situation. I shouldn't have hit you, I know that. But selling our home, this is extreme." "You struck my face," Richard said quietly. "But you slapped my dignity. That's something I will not tolerate. Not even from you." Emily's demeanor changed suddenly, anger replacing tears. "I'll fight this. I'll get a lawyer. This can't possibly be legal." It is legal. James Morrison prepared the trust himself, and he's prepared for any challenges you might mount. The provision is clear, the breach is documented, and the sale has already been executed. Richard gathered the documents and replaced them in the portfolio. 30 days, Emily. I suggest you start looking for a new home. As he turned to leave, Emily called after him, her voice breaking. Dad, wait. Please, what about us? Our family, are you really willing to destroy everything over this? Richard paused at the kitchen door, looking back at the daughter he had raised and loved with every fiber of his being. I didn't destroy anything, Emily. You did that when you decided I was worthy of contempt rather than respect. The words tasted bitter on his tongue, but they needed to be said. You slapped the dignity from my face. I'm simply taking back what's mine. He walked out, closing the door quietly behind him. There was no satisfaction in what he had done, only a profound sadness that it had come to this. But beneath the sadness lay the certainty that he had done what was necessary. Not in anger or revenge, but in the name of self-respect, in the painful recognition that sometimes love alone is not enough. The aftermath was immediate and chaotic. Emily called Greg in a panic, and he returned home early from his interview. Richard, having anticipated this, had already packed an overnight bag and arranged to stay with James until things settled down. He left through the garage entrance, avoiding another confrontation. As he drove away, he glanced in his rearview mirror at the house he had built with such love and care. It stood as a monument to his devotion to Emily and Margaret, to the family they had been, and the dreams they had shared. Now it would become something else entirely: luxury townhomes for wealthy strangers who would never know the love and sacrifice embedded in those walls. The thought should have devastated him. Instead, he felt a curious sense of liberation. The house had become a symbol of his diminishment, a place where his worth had been systematically devalued. Walking away from it was an act of self-preservation as much as it was a lesson for Emily. James welcomed Richard to his spacious Beacon Hill townhome with gruff sympathy. Guest rooms made up. Stay as long as you need. It won't be long, Richard assured him. I've been looking at properties in Maine. There's a small cottage near Bar Harbor that seems perfect. James raised an eyebrow. Maine, that's a significant move, Rich. I need distance. A fresh start. From Emily, you mean? Richard nodded, unable to voice the painful truth that remaining near his daughter would be a constant reminder of all they had lost. She'll need time to process this, to understand why it happened. Maybe someday we can rebuild something, but not while the wounds are still fresh. That evening, Richard's phone exploded with messages and calls, Emily alternating between tearful pleas and angry threats. Greg attempting to be the voice of reason while clearly supporting his wife. Even Michael sent a confused text. Grandpa Mom is crying. What's happening? Are we really losing our house? That last one nearly broke Richard's resolve. Michael was innocent in all this, a child caught in the crossfire of adult mistakes and consequences. Richard responded carefully. I love you, Michael. What's happening between your mom and me is complicated, but none of it changes how I feel about you. We'll talk soon, I promise. The next call came from Martha Dawson. Richard, there's quite a commotion at the house. Emily is telling anyone who will listen that you've gone crazy and are trying to make them homeless. Richard sighed. I expected as much. Are you all right, Martha? I never intended to drag you into this. I dragged myself in when I offered you that security footage, she replied firmly, and I don't regret it. That girl needed a wake-up call about how she was treating you. Thank you for your support. It means more than you know. Where are you staying? You're welcome here if you need a place. I'm with an old friend for now. I'll be leaving Boston soon, though, heading up to Maine. Maine, Martha sounded surprised. That's quite a change. I need a fresh start somewhere without memories around every corner. After hanging up, Richard sat in James's living room, staring out at the Boston skyline as darkness fell. The city lights blinked on one by one, creating a tapestry of illumination against the night sky. Somewhere out there, Emily was grappling with the consequences of her actions. Was she reflecting on the path that had led them here? Was she beginning to understand the depth of the wound she had inflicted? Or was she simply angry and resentful, casting herself as the victim in a story where she had been the aggressor? Richard hoped for the former, but prepared himself for the latter. Emily had spent years cultivating a sense of entitlement that had blinded her to her own behavior. It would take more than a single shock, however severe, to strip away those layers of self-deception. The following morning, Richard received an unexpected call from Greg. "Richard, can we meet, just the two of us?" They arranged to meet at a small coffee shop in Cambridge neutral territory, away from prying eyes and potential drama. Greg arrived looking haggard, the strain of recent events evident in the dark circles beneath his eyes and the slump of his normally confident posture. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Greg began after they had settled with their coffees. "Emily doesn't know I'm here. She'd be furious if she found out." "I appreciate your discretion," Richard replied, studying his son-in-law with new eyes. Greg had always been charming and ambitious, a perfect match for Emily's drive. But the scandal that had derailed his career had revealed cracks in that polished facade. Now sitting across from Richard with an air of defeat, he seemed more human than ever before. "I watched the security footage," Greg said quietly. "Emily doesn't know I've seen it. She told me you were exaggerating what happened, that it was just a small argument that got out of hand." Richard remained silent, letting Greg continue. "But that's not what I saw. I saw my wife strike her father, the man who built our home, with his own hands. I saw her say terrible things to you, things no child should ever say to their parent." Greg looked down at his coffee, his expression troubled. "I'm not here to defend her, Richard. What she did was wrong, inexcusable." "Then why are you here, Greg?" "To understand." This response, selling the house, it seems so extreme, so final. Richard considered his words carefully. "It wasn't a decision I made lightly or in the heat of the moment. It came after years of watching Emily's respect for me erode, culminating in that public humiliation. The slap was merely the final act in a long pattern of behavior." Greg nodded slowly. "I've noticed it too, especially since my issues at work. She's become harder, more focused on appearances than substance. The pressure she's under at the firm, trying to maintain our lifestyle on her income alone, it's changed her. That may explain her behavior, Greg, but it doesn't excuse it." "I know. I'm not trying to excuse it. I'm trying to understand how we got here, how my brilliant, compassionate wife became someone capable of treating her father this way." Greg looked up, meeting Richard's gaze directly. "I love Emily, despite everything, but I can't support her in this. What she did to you was wrong, and there have to be consequences." The admission stunned Richard. He had expected Greg to stand firmly by Emily's side, presenting a united front against him. This nuanced perspective, this willingness to acknowledge fault even in someone he loved, spoke volumes about Greg's character. "What will you do now?" Richard asked. "Stand by my wife and son while they navigate this upheaval. Try to help Emily see that this situation is of her own making, not yours. It won't be easy. She's convinced herself you're punishing her out of spite." "I'm not," Richard said softly. "I'm teaching her about respect and dignity in the only way that seems to resonate. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the most necessary." Greg nodded thoughtfully. "For what it's worth, I think you are right. And I think somewhere deep down beneath all the anger and indignation, Emily knows it too." As they parted, Greg hesitated, then extended his hand. "I hope this isn't goodbye, Richard. Despite everything, you are still family." Richard shook his hand, feeling a surprising surge of respect for the younger man. "Take care of them, Greg, and take care of yourself." The meeting left Richard with much to consider. Greg's unexpected support had revealed a complexity to the situation he hadn't fully appreciated. Perhaps there was hope for healing after all, though the path would be long and difficult. That hope was short-lived. That evening, Richard received a call from James, his tone unusually tense. "Rich, we have a situation. Emily has filed an emergency motion to halt the sale. She's claiming undue influence and questioning your mental competence." "My mental competence?" Richard repeated, incredulous. "She's suggesting your decision to sell the house is evidence of cognitive decline or emotional instability. It's a desperate move, but it could potentially delay things if the judge grants a temporary stay." Richard felt a fresh wave of hurt at this newest betrayal. To question his mental faculties, to suggest he was incompetent, it was a low blow even in the context of their current conflict. "What do? We fight it. The evidence is on our side, and frankly, her claim is flimsy at best. I've scheduled an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning. You'll need to be there, and I suggest you prepare yourself. It won't be pleasant." The courtroom was sterile and impersonal, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the proceedings. Richard sat beside James, his posture rigid as he avoided looking at Emily and her attorney on the opposite side of the room. The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, reviewed the filings with methodical precision before addressing the court. "This is an unusual case," she began. "Ms. Hayes is seeking to halt the sale of property based on claims that her father, who initiated the sale under a trust provision, is experiencing cognitive decline or emotional disturbance. Mr. Morrison, would you like to respond to these allegations?" James rose smoothly. "Your Honor, these claims are not only baseless, but insulting to my client. Anderson is of sound mind and made this decision after careful deliberation following a serious breach of family trust. We have video evidence demonstrating this breach, which directly triggers the provision in question." The judge turned to Emily's attorney. "Mr. Patel, your response." The lawyer, sleek and confident in an expensive suit, stood. "Your Honor, while the incident in question was regrettable, it was a momentary lapse in judgment during a stressful period. The response, selling a family home without discussion or warning, is disproportionate and suggests impaired decision-making capacity." "I'd like to see this video evidence," the judge stated. Richard tensed as the security footage played on the courtroom monitor. Watching it again in this public setting brought back the humiliation with fresh intensity. When it concluded, the judge's expression had hardened noticeably. "Mrs. Hayes," she addressed Emily directly, "you struck your father and made several deeply disrespectful statements, including suggesting he was living on your charity. Is this correct?" Emily, visibly uncomfortable, nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. It was a terrible mistake, one I deeply regret." "Have you apologized to your father for this incident?" A telling pause. "I've tried to reach out, but he's been avoiding me." Richard couldn't help but look at Emily, then shocked by the blatant lie. She had made no attempt to contact him, let alone apologize, until after learning about the sale. The judge noticed his reaction. "Mr. Anderson, would you care to comment on that statement?" Richard cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my daughter did not attempt to contact me at any point between the incident and my informing her of the sale. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing." The judge considered this, then turned back to Emily's attorney. "Mr. Artyom Patel, regarding your client's claim about Mr. Anderson's mental competence, do you have any medical evidence or expert testimony to support this allegation?" "Not at present, Your Honor, but we are seeking a psychiatric evaluation." "So you have no evidence," the judge interrupted. "Just speculation based on your client's disagreement with her father's decision." "Your Honor, the extreme nature of the decision itself is consistent with the legal provision both parties agreed to when the property was transferred," the judge finished for him. "I've reviewed the trust documents. The language is clear and specific. Mr. Anderson retained the right to sell the property in case of severe breach of family trust, explicitly including physical assault." The judge removed her glasses, her expression severe. "Motion denied. The sale may proceed as planned. And Ms. Hayes," she added, her tone sharpening, "I would strongly advise against making unfounded claims about your father's mental competence in the future. Such allegations are serious and should not be used as legal tactics without substantial evidence." As they exited the courtroom, Richard maintained his composure, though inside he was reeling from the additional betrayal. To question his sanity, to paint him as mentally unstable, it revealed just how far Emily was willing to go to avoid facing the consequences of her actions. Outside, Emily approached him, her expression a mixture of anger and desperation. "Are you happy now you've won? You've humiliated me in court just like you claim I humiliated you." Richard met her gaze steadily. This was never about winning Emily. It was about consequences and respect. "Respect," she scoffed. "You're destroying our family over your wounded pride." "No, Emily. You destroyed our family when you decided I was worthy of contempt rather than respect. When you slapped me in front of our neighbors. When you planned to sell the house and put me in a home without even discussing it with me. So that's what this is about. You overheard a private conversation and decided to punish me for it. This is about a pattern of behavior, not a single incident. A pattern you still refuse to acknowledge." Richard felt a profound weariness settle over him. "The house will be sold. You have 26 days left to find a new place to live. I suggest you focus on that rather than continuing to fight a battle you cannot win." Emily's eyes filled with tears of frustration. "Where are you going? Where will you live? That's no longer your concern." With those final words, Richard turned and walked away, leaving his daughter standing alone on the courthouse steps. That evening, as Richard sat in James's study reviewing properties in Maine, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Hesitantly, he answered. "Grandpa, it's Michael." Richard's heart clenched at the sound of his grandson's voice. "Michael, I'm so glad you called. Are you okay?" "Not really," the boy admitted. "Mom and Dad are fighting all the time. Mom keeps saying you've gone crazy and are punishing her, but Dad says she deserved it because of how she treated you. I don't understand what's happening." The pain and confusion in Michael's voice cut through Richard like a knife. This innocent child was collateral damage in a conflict he should never have been exposed to. "I'm sorry you're caught in the middle of this, Michael. None of it is your fault, and none of it changes how much I love you." "Are we really losing our house?" Richard chose his words carefully. "Your parents will need to find a new place to live, yes. But they'll receive money from the sale that will help them buy a nice new home." "But why, Grandpa? Why did you sell our house?" How to explain such complex adult dynamics to a 12-year-old? Richard took a deep breath. "Your mom did something that hurt me very deeply, something that showed a lack of respect. In a family, respect is essential. It's the foundation everything else is built on. When that respect is broken, there have to be consequences." A pause as Michael absorbed this. "Mom slapped you. I saw the video." Richard's breath caught. "You saw that?" "Dad was watching it on his computer. He didn't know I was there." Michael's voice dropped to a near whisper. "I've never seen Mom act like that before. It scared me." "It scared me too," Richard admitted softly. "People sometimes do things they wouldn't normally do when they're under a lot of pressure. Your mom has been under tremendous stress lately." "That doesn't make it okay though, does it?" "No, it doesn't. Actions have consequences. Michael, that's an important lesson to learn." Another pause. "Are you coming back?" "Grandpa?" The question tore at Richard's heart. "Not to the house, no. I'll be moving away soon, but that doesn't mean we won't see each other. We'll figure something out, I promise." "I miss you." "I miss you too, Michael. More than you know." After hanging up, dear Richard sat motionless, the weight of Michael's innocent suffering pressing down on him. The boy was right to be confused. How could he possibly understand the complex dynamics at play? Richard had been so focused on teaching Emily a lesson about respect that he hadn't fully considered how it would affect his grandson. For the first time since making his decision, doubt crept in. Was he doing the right thing? Was the lesson worth the collateral damage to Michael's, to their family as a whole? But then he remembered Emily's hand striking his face, the contempt in her voice, as she declared he lived on her charity, the conversation about selling the house and placing him in a retirement home. If he backed down now, what message would that send? That respect was optional. That dignity could be violated without consequence. No. The path forward was difficult but necessary. Sometimes healing required first cutting out the infection, no matter how painful the procedure might be. The following days passed in a blur of preparations. Richard finalized the purchase of a small cottage in Bar Harbor, a peaceful place on the risky Maine coast, with a view of the Atlantic that reminded him of happier times. He arranged for his few possessions to be shipped there, sold his car in favor of a more practical vehicle for rural living, and began saying goodbye to the few friends he had maintained in Boston. Martha Dawson invited him for a farewell dinner, her kindness a balm to his wounded spirit. "Are you sure about this move, Richard? Maine is a long way from your family." "Distance might be what we all need right now," he replied. "Time and space to gain perspective. And if Emily never comes around, if she never acknowledges what she did was wrong." Richard had considered this possibility many sleepless nights. "Then I'll have to accept that as the price of standing up for my dignity. I won't live the rest of my days being treated with contempt by my own child." Martha nodded understanding in her eyes. "For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing, difficult as it is. Thank you for that, and for everything else." Richard reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Your friendship has meant more than you know during this ordeal." Write to me from Maine, she insisted. Let me know how you're settling in. I promise. On his last night in Boston, Richard returned to the house one final time. He didn't go inside Emily, and her family were still living there for another week before the closing, but stood on the sidewalk gazing up at the structure he had built with such love and care. Every beam, every nail, every shingle had been placed by his hands. He remembered the exhaustion and the exhilaration, the blisters and the pride. He remembered Emily bringing him lemonade as he worked under the summer sun, her young face shining with admiration for her father. Where had that girl gone? When had she been replaced by the woman who saw him as nothing but a burden, an embarrassment, an obstacle to her ambitions? As he stood lost in these thoughts, a car pulled into the driveway. Greg emerged, spotted Richard, and approached cautiously. I thought you might come by, he said, his voice gentle, to say goodbye. Richard nodded, unable to find words past the lump in his throat. Emily's not home, Greg added. She's at her yoga class. Michael's inside, though. He'd love to see you. I don't want to make things more difficult for him. Or for you. Greg studied him for a moment. You know, I've been thinking a lot about respect lately, about what it means, why it matters so much. I didn't fully understand before, but I think I do now. What changed? Watching Emily these past weeks. The way she's refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, the way she's cast herself as the victim despite clear evidence to the contrary. It's opened my eyes to patterns I hadn't noticed before. Greg looked back at the house, his expression troubled. She treated you the way she treats many people in her life, as if their worth is measured only by their usefulness to her. I've enabled that behavior for too long. Richard was struck by Greg's insight. It was a painful truth, but one that needed acknowledgement if healing was ever to occur. For what it's worth, Greg continued, I believe you did the right thing. It was harsh, yes, but sometimes harshness is necessary to break through denial. Whether Emily eventually sees that or not, I can't say, but I see it. Richard felt a surprising sense of validation from his son-in-law's words. Take care of Michael. Help him understand if you can. I will. Greg hesitated, then added, This isn't the end, Richard. It's a painful chapter, but not the conclusion of the story. Remember that. As Richard drove away from Boston the next morning, those words echoed in his mind. Not the end, but a painful chapter. He hoped Greg was right. He hoped that someday Emily would understand why he had been forced to take such drastic action. Why respect and dignity were worth fighting for, even at the cost of comfort and connection. The road stretched before him, leading north toward Maine, toward a new beginning. Behind him lay decades of memories, sacrifices, love, and now profound disappointment. As the miles accumulated, Richard felt a gradual lightening of the burden he had carried for so long. The burden of accepting disrespect in the name of family harmony. The burden of diminishing himself to avoid conflict. He was 78 years old. Too old to start over completely, perhaps, but not too old to reclaim his dignity. Not too old to demand the respect he had earned through a lifetime of giving. Not too old to teach his daughter the most difficult lesson of all, that love without respect is a hollow thing, as empty and fragile as a house built on sand. The Maine coastline welcomed him with its rugged beauty, the scent of pine and salt air filling his lungs as he drove the final miles to his new home. The cottage was modest but solid, perched on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic. As Richard stepped out of his car, the distant cry of seagulls and the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore greeted. Onishmim, this was not the retirement he had envisioned, not the peaceful conclusion to his story he had worked toward all his life. But as he stood facing the vast ocean, Richard felt something unexpected stir within him. Not happiness, not yet, but something like peace, something like freedom. The wind carried away the last of his doubts, leaving behind only the certainty that he had done what was necessary, what was right. He had stood for his dignity when it mattered most. And in that standing, painful as it was, he had preserved the most essential part of it himself. The Maine mornings were different from those in Boston. They unfolded slowly, deliberately, with a quiet grandeur that matched the rugged coastline. Richard found himself waking earlier than usual, drawn to the porch of his cottage by the promise of dawn breaking over the Atlantic. Coffee in hand, he would watch as the first light of day painted the water in shades of gold and amber, transforming the dark sea into a canvas of shifting colors. It had been 3 weeks since he'd left Boston. 3 weeks of silence and solitude of rebuilding the rhythms of his life in this new place. The cottage, though modest, suited him perfectly. A small living area with a stone fireplace, a functional kitchen, one bedroom, and a workshop he'd set up in what had once been a storage shed. The previous owner had left behind basic tools, nothing compared to what Richard had accumulated over decades, but enough to keep his hands busy. And busy hands, Richard had discovered, were essential for a mind-seeking peace. He spent hours restoring old furniture found at local yard sales, repairing loose boards on the porch, or simply walking the shore, collecting driftwood that might someday become something beautiful. Physical labor had always been his meditation, his way of processing emotion without drowning in it. The locals were reserved but friendly, in that distinctly New England way, respectful of privacy while offering small kindnesses. Mrs. Sullivan from the general store would set aside the newspaper for him. Ted at the hardware store recommended the best local fishermen when Richard mentioned wanting fresh catch for dinner. No one pried into his past or asked why a man his age had moved to a remote coastal town alone. On his third Sunday in Bar Harbor, Richard ventured into town for the morning service at a small, non-denominational church. He slipped into a back pew, nodding politely to those who noticed his presence, but making no effort to engage. The sermon that day was about forgiveness, a concept that had been circling his thoughts like a persistent seabird. Forgiveness, the minister had said, his voice carrying clearly through the small space, is not about absolving others of responsibility for their actions. It's about freeing ourselves from the burden of resentment. It's recognizing that holding on to hurt only keeps us chained to the very thing that wounded us. The words had followed Richard home, echoing in his mind as he prepared his solitary lunch. Was forgiveness possible in his situation? Could he forgive Emily while still holding her accountable for her actions? Or were accountability and forgiveness mutually exclusive? He had no answers, only questions that seemed to multiply with each passing day. Richard was arranging shells he'd collected on a shelf when the phone rang. Few people had his new number. James, Martha, and reluctantly Greg, whom he'd called once to check on Michael. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Anderson, this is Vanessa Chen from Meridian Properties." "Yes, Ms. Chen, what can I do for you?" "I wanted to inform you that the closing went through this morning without any issues. The funds have been transferred as arranged, 70% to Ms. Hayes' account and 30% to yours. The property is officially ours now." Richard felt a strange hollowness at the news. The house he had built with his own hands now belonged to the strangers who would likely tear it down to build luxury townhomes. Yet there was also relief. The final legal tie had been severed, the decision made irrevocable. "Thank you for letting me know," he said simply. "There is one other matter," Vanessa continued. "During the final walkthrough, we found a box in the attic labeled Richard Personal. Ms. Hayes mentioned it must belong to you. We can have it shipped to your current address if you'd like." Richard frowned. He'd been methodical in packing his belongings, certain he'd left nothing behind. "What's in the box?" "I haven't opened it myself, but it appears to be old papers, photographs, perhaps some keepsakes. Nothing of significant monetary value from what I could tell." A memory surfaced, a cardboard box he'd stored in the attic years ago, containing mementos from his early years with Margaret. Items too painful to look at after her death, but too precious to discard. In the chaos of recent events, he'd forgotten its existence. "If it wouldn't be too much trouble, I'd appreciate having it sent." "Of course, we'll arrange delivery this week." After hanging up, Richard sat heavily in his armchair, the finality of the situation settling over him. The house was gone. The home he had built with such care, such devotion, would soon be reduced to lumber and memories. He had known this would happen, had set the events in motion himself. Yet the reality of it still struck him with unexpected force. That evening, Richard wrote to Martha as promised, describing his new life in Maine without mentioning the bittersweet news about the house. He wouldn't burden her with his momentary melancholy. Instead, he focused on the beauty of his surroundings, the kindness of his new neighbors, the small workshop he was establishing. The letter complete, he sealed it and set it aside for mailing the next day. As he prepared for bed, Richard's phone chimed with a text message, an unusual occurrence at this hour. It was from Greg. "Michael wants to talk to you. Is tomorrow after school okay?" "Around 400. Richard texted back his agreement, his heart lightening at the prospect of speaking with his grandson. He had missed the boy terribly, his absence a persistent ache amid the new rhythms of Maine life. The following afternoon, Richard found himself pacing anxiously as he waited for Michael's call. When it finally came, the sound of his grandson's voice was like a balm to his soul. "Grandpa, how's Maine? Is it cold there? Do you live near the ocean?" Richard smiled at the barrage of questions. "It's beautiful, Michael. A bit chilly now, that fall is setting in, and yes, I can see the ocean from my front porch. I've been collecting shells and interesting pieces of driftwood." "Cool. I miss you, Grandpa." "I miss you too, buddy. How are things going? How's school?" A slight hesitation. "School's okay. We moved into a new house last week. It's smaller than our old one, but I have my own room still. Dad helped me put up my solar system mobile." "That sounds nice. How are your parents doing?" Another pause, longer this time. "They fight a lot. Not yelling fights, but quiet ones, which are almost worse. Mom cries sometimes when she thinks I'm not around. Dad stays at work late most nights." Richard closed his eyes, pain blooming in his chest. Michael was perceptive. Always had been. The boy noticed everything, understood more than adults gave him credit for. "I'm sorry to hear that, Michael. Sometimes adults go through difficult periods, especially during big changes. Mom says it's your fault things are bad, that you ruined everything because you were angry about what happened at the party. But Dad says that's not fair, that Mom needs to take responsibility for her own actions." The brutal honesty of a 12-year-old cut straight to the heart of the matter. "What do you think, Michael?" "I think," the boy paused, clearly weighing his words carefully. "I think Mom did something really wrong when she hit you. I've never seen her like that before. But I also think selling our house was a pretty big punishment." Richard considered this assessment. Out of the mouths of babes often came wisdom adults had forgotten. "That's a fair perspective, Michael. Sometimes situations between adults are complicated with no simple right or wrong answer." "Grandpa, will you ever come visit us, or can I come visit you in Maine?" "I'd like that very much. Let me talk to your dad about arranging something." Maybe during your winter break, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Michael's science project, a book he was reading, the stray cat he'd been feeding at the new house. By the time they said goodbye, Richard felt both uplifted and troubled. The joy of reconnecting with his grandson was tempered by the knowledge of the ongoing turmoil in Emily's household. The promised box arrived 3 days later, delivered by a local service. Richard set it on his kitchen table, studying the faded marker that spelled out his name in his own handwriting. For several minutes, he simply stared at it, uncertain whether opening it would bring comfort or renewed pain. Finally, with careful hands, he cut the tape and lifted the lid. Inside lay fragments of a life long past, photographs of Margaret before her illness, a dried corsage from their wedding letters they had exchanged during a brief separation when Richard had worked a construction job in another state. Beneath these treasures lay a stack of Emily's childhood drawings, report cards, and school projects he had saved. At the very bottom, nestled in tissue paper, was a small velvet box. Richard opened it with trembling fingers to reveal Margaret's engagement ring, a modest diamond he had saved for months to purchase. He had thought it lost years ago during a movie, had mourned its disappearance as yet another piece of Margaret slipping away from him. Tears blurred his vision as he held the ring to the light, memories washing over him in powerful waves. Margaret's laughter when he had nervously proposed, the way her eyes had lit up despite the ring's modest size. Her whispered yes that had changed his life forever. As he carefully returned the ring to its box, Richard's hand brushed against something wedged in the corner of the larger container. Reaching in, he extracted a folded piece of paper he didn't recognize. Curious, he opened it to find a letter written in Emily's elegant script dated just 1 week ago. "Ed, I don't know if you'll ever see this note. I'm placing it in your box of mementos, hoping Vanessa Chen will follow through on her offer to send it to you. If you're reading this, she did. First, I want you to know that I found Mom's ring while packing and immediately set it aside for you. I know how much it meant to you both. It should be with you, not lost among our things. Second, I need to say what I should have said weeks ago. I'm sorry. Deeply, truly sorry for how I treated you, not just at the party, but for years before that. The slap was inexcusable, unforgivable, but it wasn't isolated. It was the culmination of a pattern of disrespect that I allowed to develop and grow. I've spent these weeks trying to understand how I became someone capable of treating you that way. How your daughter, who once adored you more than anyone in the world, could have forgotten the value of your sacrifices, your love, your presence in my life. The answers aren't simple, and they don't excuse my actions. Stress, financial pressure, Greg's professional disgrace. These were factors, but not justifications. The truth is harder to face. I became so focused on status, on appearances, on climbing higher, that I began measuring everyone's worth, even yours, by what they could contribute to that ascent. It's taken losing our home, nearly losing my marriage, and seeing the confusion in Michael's eyes to make me recognize what I've become. I don't like this person, Dad. I don't want to be her anymore. I understand why you sold the house. I fought it, denied it, raged against it, but in my clearer moments, I understand. You weren't being vindictive. You were teaching me about consequences, about respect, about dignity. Lessons I should have learned long before now. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not even asking for it. I just needed you to know that your lesson, painful as it was, has been received. Whether we ever speak again or not, I will carry this understanding forward. With love and regret, Emily. Richard read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking more with each reading. The words seemed to shimmer and dance on the page, Emily's voice echoing in his mind, as clearly as if she were standing before him. Was this genuine remorse or another manipulation? Had the loss of the house truly catalyzed the self-reflection she described? Or was this a calculated attempt to regain his sympathy? He wanted to believe it was real. Wanted to believe that the daughter he had raised with such love and care still existed somewhere beneath the hardened exterior of the woman who had struck him. But trust once shattered was not easily rebuilt. Setting the letter aside, Richard moved to his porch, needing the steadying presence of the ocean. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rocky shoreline as waves crashed rhythmically against the cliffs below. Nature's constancy was a comfort, the tide's eternal cycle of advance and retreat, the unchanging song of the gulls, the steady progression of the sun across the sky. What would Margaret advise if she were here? She had always been his moral compass, his voice of reason when emotion threatened to cloud his judgment. She would tell him to proceed cautiously to protect his heart while remaining open to the possibility of healing. She would remind him that true change takes time to prove itself, that actions speak louder than words, no matter how eloquently written. But she would also remind him of the importance of family, of the bonds that transcend momentary hurts. Margaret had valued forgiveness not as a gift to the offender, but as a necessity for the wounded heart. Holding on to anger, she often said, is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. As darkness fell, Richard made a simple decision. He would acknowledge Emily's letter but make no commitments. He would maintain his boundaries while leaving a door slightly ajar, not wide open but no longer sealed shut. It was a middle path, neither complete reconciliation nor permanent estrangement. The next morning, Richard sent a brief text message to Emily's number. I received your letter. Thank you for your honesty. I need time, but I'm glad you're reflecting on these important matters. Take care of Michael and yourself. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. Autumn deepened into winter, transforming the Maine coastline into a stark landscape of grays and whites. Richard found unexpected joy in the season's severity, the dramatic storms that sent waves crashing against the shore, the pristine beauty of snow-covered rocks, the startling clarity of the night sky when the clouds parted to reveal a universe of stars. He had settled into a comfortable routine. Mornings were for practical tasks, maintaining the cottage, shopping for necessities, occasionally helping neighbors with repairs they couldn't manage themselves. Afternoons he devoted to his workshop, creating small pieces of furniture that the owner of a local craft shop had begun selling on consignment. Evenings were for reading, correspondence, and reflection. Communication with Boston remained limited but significant. Weekly calls with Michael became a cherished ritual. Occasional texts from Greg kept him informed of major developments. Martha's letters arrived regularly, bringing news of the neighborhood and gentle inquiries about his well-being. From Emily, there was silence following his acknowledgement of her letter, a silence he interpreted not as indifference but as respect for his request for time. As the holidays approached, Richard found himself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of family. Thanksgiving would mark his first major holiday alone since Margaret's passing. The prospect stirred a melancholy he couldn't entirely suppress, despite his determination to embrace his new life. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, Richard received an unexpected email from Greg. Richard, I hope this finds you well and settling into life in Maine. Michael talks about you constantly and treasures your weekly calls. I'm writing with a somewhat unusual request. Emily and I have been attending counseling, both individually and as a couple. It's been challenging but illuminating. Her therapist has suggested that family reconciliation, if possible, would be beneficial for all involved, particularly for Michael, who misses you terribly. We would like to invite you to join us for Thanksgiving dinner. We've rented a small house on the coast about an hour south of Bar Harbor. Neutral territory, so to speak. Just the four of us, no extended family or friends to complicate matters. I understand if this feels premature. There's no pressure to accept, and we'll respect whatever decision you make. Emily knows I'm extending this invitation, but she was hesitant to reach out directly, fearing you might see it as presumptuous, given the current state of your relationship. Whatever you decide, please know that you are in our thoughts, especially as the holidays approach. Warm regards. Gregor. Richard stared at the screen long after he'd finished reading, conflicting emotions churning within him. The invitation represented exactly what he had hoped for: an opportunity for healing, for rebuilding broken bridges. Yet it also stirred anxiety. Was he ready to face Emily in person, to risk reopening wounds that had only begun to heal? After much consideration, Richard composed his reply. Greg, thank you for your thoughtful invitation. I'm encouraged to hear that you and Emily are seeking professional guidance and working on your relationship. That speaks well of your commitment to healing and growth. While I appreciate the opportunity to spend Thanksgiving with you, Emily, and especially Michael, I believe it may be wise to take smaller steps before attempting a holiday gathering which carries inherent emotional weight and expectations. Instead, I would like to suggest meeting for lunch or coffee beforehand, perhaps this weekend, if you're available to make the drive. This would give us a chance to gauge where things stand in a less pressured environment. Please let me know your thoughts on this alternative. I'm open to discussing other possibilities as well. Best regards, Richard. Greg's response came within the hour, expressing understanding and agreement with Richard's approach. They arranged to meet that Saturday at a small restaurant in Camden, roughly halfway between their locations. Greg would come alone for this initial meeting, a decision Richard found both disappointing. He missed Michael and relieving he wasn't yet ready to see Emily. The restaurant Greg had chosen was a converted boathouse overlooking Penobscot Bay, its large windows offering expansive views of the water. Richard arrived early, selecting a quiet table in the corner where they could speak privately. As he waited, he rehearsed what he might say, how he might respond to various scenarios, but found himself abandoning these mental scripts almost immediately. This situation required authenticity, not careful preparation. Greg arrived punctually, looking more rested than when Richard had last seen him. They exchanged slightly awkward greetings before settling into their seats and ordering coffee. Thank you for agreeing to meet, Greg began. I know this isn't easy. How are things? Richard asked, opting for a neutral opening. Greg's expression grew thoughtful. Better in some ways, different certainly. The move was difficult for everyone, but the new house is coming to feel like home. It's smaller but more manageable financially, which has reduced some pressure. And Emily, how is she doing? She's, Greg paused, choosing his words carefully. She's doing the work, Richard. Real work on herself. The counseling has helped her recognize patterns that led to how she treated you and others, including me. There's a humility to her now that wasn't there before, a willingness to acknowledge mistakes and take responsibility for them. Richard nodded, absorbing this assessment. And your relationship? We're rebuilding. It hasn't been easy. What happened with you brought a lot of other issues to the surface: my financial missteps, her controlling tendencies, our mutual obsession with status and appearances. We're learning to communicate honestly without the power struggles that dominated before. Greg met Richard's gaze directly. I love her, Richard. I always have. But I needed to love her enough to hold her accountable, not just enable behavior that was hurting everyone around her. That takes courage, Richard acknowledged. Less courage than what you did. Greg's voice softened. I want you to know something. When you sold the house, when you stood up for your dignity, you didn't just teach Emily a lesson. You taught me one too, about what real strength looks like, about having the courage to enforce boundaries even when it's painful. The admission touched Richard deeply. He had never considered that his actions might have impacted Greg in this way. Emily would like to see you, Greg continued, when you're ready. No pressure, but she's been working with her therapist specifically on making amends, real amends, not just apologies. I'm not sure when I'll be ready for that, Richard admitted, but I'm open to the possibility. That's progress from where I was 3 months ago. They spoke for nearly 2 hours, moving from difficult topics to lighter ones. Greg shared stories about Michael's adjustment to his new school, about the stray cat that had now become an unofficial family pet, about his own efforts to rebuild his career through consulting work. Richard described his life in Maine, the small woodworking business he was developing, the peace he had found in his solitary but purposeful days. As they prepared to leave, Greg hesitated. About Thanksgiving, I understand why you suggested this meeting first, and I respect your decision. But the invitation stands. Even if it's just for dessert or coffee, even if it's the day after. Michael would be overjoyed to see you, and it would mean a lot to Emily, though she'd understand if you declined. Richard promised to consider it, making no commitments but leaving possibilities open. The meeting had been more positive than he'd anticipated, a tentative first step on what might be a long road to reconciliation. Over the next few days, Richard found himself thinking constantly about the Thanksgiving invitation. The sensible choice would be to decline, to maintain the careful distance he had established. But something in him, a voice that sounded suspiciously like Margaret's, urged him to consider the alternative. What ultimately tipped the scale was a call from Michael 3 days before Thanksgiving. "Grandpa, wait, are you coming for Thanksgiving?" Dad said. "Maybe you might." "I haven't decided yet, buddy. It's complicated. Because you and Mom are still mad at each other." Richard smiled at the directness. It's not exactly anger anymore. It's more caution. When people hurt each other, it takes time to rebuild trust. "Mom's really different now," Michael said quietly. "She cries sometimes when she talks about you, and she apologizes for stuff, even small things. She never used to do that." Out of the mouths of babes, Richard thought again. That sounds like positive change. "So will you come? Please, I miss you so much." How could he resist that plea? "Tell you what, I won't commit to the full dinner, but I might come for dessert. Would that be okay?" Michael's excited response left no doubt about his feelings on the matter. That evening, Richard texted Greg, "I'll come for dessert on Thanksgiving in around 6 around if that works, just for an hour or so." Greg's response was immediate. "That would be wonderful. We'll be at 247 Harbor View Drive in Lincolnville." "Thank you for considering this, Richard. It means more than you know." As Thanksgiving Day dawned, Richard woke with a curious mixture of anxiety and anticipation. He spent the morning keeping busy with small tasks, trying not to overthink the evening ahead. Around noon, he began preparing a dish to contribute, a pear and cranberry crumble that had been Margaret's specialty. The familiar process of measuring, mixing, and baking settled his nerves somewhat, connecting him to happier times and cherished memories. By 5:30, he was showered, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and his best sweater, and driving south along the coastal road. The rented house was easy to find, a charming Cape Cod with a wraparound porch set on a bluff overlooking the bay. Lights glowed warmly from the windows, and he could see movement inside as he parked and gathered his dessert from the passenger seat. For a long moment, Richard sat in his car, gathering his courage. Then, with a deep breath, he approached the front door and knocked. It was Michael who answered, his face lighting up with joy at the sight of his grandfather. "Grandpa, you came." He flung himself forward in a tight hug that Richard returned with equal enthusiasm. "Of course I came. I wouldn't miss seeing my favorite grandson on Thanksgiving." "I'm your only grandson," Michael replied with a grin, their familiar exchange bringing a surge of warmth to Richard's heart. Greg appeared in the hallway smiling. "Richard, welcome. Please come in." Richard stepped into a cozy living room decorated with simple taste. A fire crackled in the fireplace, and the air was rich with the sense of a traditional Thanksgiving meal. "I brought dessert," he said, offering the dish to Greg. "Margaret's recipe." "Thank you. It smells wonderful." Greg took the dish. "Emily's in the kitchen. Would you like a moment before—" "No, that's all right." Richard steeled himself. "Best to get the awkward part over with." Greg nodded and led the way to a bright kitchen where Emily stood arranging a tray of coffee cups. She looked up as they entered, her hands freezing in mid-motion. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken emotions. Emily looked different somehow, thinner perhaps, with less makeup. Her hair pulled back in a simple style rather than the sophisticated arrangements she had favored before. but it was her eyes that showed the most change, softer, less guarded, rimmed with a vulnerability Richard hadn't seen in years. "Dad," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for coming." Richard nodded, unable to find words for the complexity of what he felt. Emily seemed to understand. "Michael, why don't you show Grandpa the view from the back deck while Dad and I finish getting dessert ready?" The boy eagerly led Richard through French doors onto a wooden deck that offered a spectacular view of the bay. The sun had nearly set, casting the water in shades of deep purple and crimson. "Isn't it awesome?" Michael asked. "Almost as good as your place, Grandpa." "It's beautiful," Richard agreed, grateful for the moment to collect himself. The sight of Emily had affected him more strongly than he'd anticipated, not with anger or resentment, but with a complex mixture of love, grief, and cautious hope. When they returned inside, Greg had arranged the table with coffee dessert plates in three options: Richard's crumble, a pumpkin pie, and a chocolate cake. "Dad made the chocolate cake," Michael announced proudly. "He's been practicing baking. He's getting pretty good." The conversation over dessert was careful, focused primarily on safe topics. Michael's school projects, the holiday decorations in town, Richard's budding woodworking business. Emily spoke little, seemingly content to listen to observe the interaction between her son and her father. When she did contribute, her comments were thoughtful, lacking the sharp edge Richard had grown accustomed to in recent years. After they'd finished eating, Michael asked if he could show Richard his temporary bedroom. "I've got my telescope set up. On clear nights, you can see so many stars from here." As the boy led Richard upstairs, Emily and Greg remained in the dining room, giving them space for this private reconnection. Michael's room was indeed impressive, with the promised telescope positioned by a large window and his beloved solar system mobile hanging from the ceiling. "This is quite a setup," Richard commented. "Have you spotted any planets yet?" "Jupiter and Saturn, and I'm learning the constellations. Dad got me a star map that shows what you can see each season." As Michael enthusiastically detailed his astronomical observations, Richard felt a profound gratitude wash over him. Despite the upheaval, despite the painful rupture in the family, this bright, curious boy remained a constant, a testament to the resilience of children and a bridge between past and future. When they returned downstairs, Richard found Emily alone in the living room, Greg having tactfully disappeared to the kitchen to clean up. "He's been counting the days until he could show you that telescope," Emily said with a small smile. "Your approval means the world to him." Richard nodded, lowering himself into an armchair across from her. The moment he had both dreaded and anticipated had arrived, their first real conversation since the confrontation months ago. Emily met his gaze directly. "I don't know where to begin, Dad. I'm sorry seems woefully inadequate for what happened." "Perhaps it's as good a place as any," Richard replied gently. "I am sorry, deeply, truly sorry, not just for the slap, which was inexcusable, but for the years of disrespect that preceded it, for taking you for granted, for treating you as less than the remarkable father you've always been." Her voice trembled slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I've been working with a therapist to understand how I became someone capable of such cruelty. It's not been an easy process facing the ugliness within myself." "What have you learned?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. Emily took a deep breath. "That I became so fixated on external validation, status, recognition, material success, that I began evaluating everyone's worth, including yours, based on how they contributed to those goals. That I internalized toxic ideas about aging and usefulness. That I was terrified of losing control, of failing, of not living up to impossible standards I'd set for myself." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "None of that excuses what I did. But recognizing these patterns has been essential to changing them. I don't want to be that person anymore, Dad. I don't want Michael to learn those values from me." Richard listened intently, searching for signs of genuine transformation versus rehearsed contrition. What he saw in Emily's eyes, in the humble set of her shoulders, in the absence of defensive qualifiers, suggested the former. "The house," Emily continued after a moment, "I fought so hard against losing it. It seemed the greatest injustice, the cruelest punishment. But now I understand it wasn't punishment at all. It was consequence. It was a lesson I needed to learn, painful as it was." "And what lesson was that?" Richard asked softly. "That respect isn't optional in relationships that matter. that treating people with dignity isn't conditional on what they can do for you, that the foundation of family is not what we can get from each other, but how we honor each other. Her eyes filled with tears. That you deserved better from me, much better. The sincerity in her voice, the humility in her posture, the absence of the entitled anger that had characterized their last interactions all suggested a profound shift. Not complete transformation, perhaps. Such things took years, not months, but a beginning genuine and promising. I don't expect forgiveness, Emily added when Richard remained silent. I'm not even asking for it yet. I just want you to know that I'm committed to changing to becoming someone worthy of your trust again, however long that takes. Richard felt something shift within him, a loosening of the tight knot that had resided in his chest since that fateful day. Thank you for saying that, Emily. It means a great deal to hear. Can I ask you something? She ventured after a moment. Of course. Are you happy in Maine? Truly happy? The question caught him off guard. He considered it carefully before answering. I'm finding my way. There's peace there and purpose. Happiness comes in moments, watching the sunrise, finishing a piece in my workshop, talking with Michael on the phone. It's different from what I expected for this chapter of my life, but not without its satisfactions. Emily nodded, accepting this measured response. I hope someday, when you're ready, you might consider moving closer. Not to our home, I understand why that wouldn't work, but perhaps somewhere nearby where Michael could visit more easily. Where we could, she hesitated, where we could slowly rebuild what I damaged. That's a possibility for the future, Richard acknowledged. But for now, I need the space that Maine provides. The distance has been healing for me. I understand. Thank you for being here today. It means more than I can express. Their conversation was interrupted by Michael's return, followed shortly by Greg with an offer of more coffee. The evening continued with a game of cards that Michael insisted everyone play, the tension gradually easing as they engaged in this simple family activity. When the time came for Richard to leave, Michael hugged him fiercely. Can we do this again? Maybe for Christmas. We'll see, Richard replied, not making promises he wasn't certain he could keep. But I'll definitely call you on Sunday as usual. Emily walked him to the door while Greg helped Michael prepare for bed. In the privacy of the entryway, she spoke one final time. Whatever happens between us going forward, I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you have done for me throughout my life. The sacrifices you made, the love you showed, the example you set, I see it all clearly now. I only regret that it took losing you to recognize it. Richard was moved by her words, by the evident sincerity behind them. You haven't lost me, Emily. We're finding a new way forward, that's all. As he drove back to Bar Harbor under a canopy of stars, Richard felt lighter than he had in months. The evening had not been perfect. There had been awkward moments, careful navigation of sensitive topics, the weight of shared history, both beautiful and painful. But there had also been genuine connection, honest communication, and the first tentative steps toward healing. Richard's cottage welcomed him with familiar comfort when he returned. He built a small fire in the fireplace and sat before it, reflecting on the day's events. The path forward would not be simple or straightforward. Trust once broken could not be instantly restored. Respect once violated required consistent demonstration to be reestablished. But for the first time since the rupture, Richard felt genuinely hopeful that reconciliation was possible. The winter passed in a rhythm of quiet days and small, significant connections. Richard maintained his weekly calls with Michael, occasionally speaking with Greg afterward. Emily respected his need for gradual reintegration, sending brief, thoughtful messages without expecting immediate responses. Each interaction built upon the last, slowly reconstructing a foundation of mutual respect. Christmas brought another gathering, this time at a rental cabin in the mountains where they spent a day sledding and building snowmen before exchanging modest gifts around a pine tree Michael had helped decorate. The atmosphere was warmer, less strained than Thanksgiving had been, though still careful. By early spring, Richard had established a small but growing reputation for his handcrafted furniture. A feature in a local magazine led to commissions that kept his workshop busy and provided a satisfying sense of purpose. He joined a community choir, made friends with a couple who shared his interest in birdwatching, and began volunteering at a local woodworking program for at-risk youth. His life in Maine was no longer merely an escape. It had become a genuine new chapter with its own rewards and challenges. It was on a bright April morning as Richard worked in his garden preparing the soil for summer vegetables that he received an unexpected visit. A rental car pulled into his driveway, and Emily emerged alone looking uncertain as she approached. "Dad, I hope it's okay that I came. I was in Portland for a conference and thought, well, I should have called first." Richard straightened, brushing soil from his hands. "It's all right. Would you like some coffee? I was about due for a break." They settled on the porch overlooking the ocean, mugs in hand, a comfortable silence between them. Emily seemed content to simply be present to share this moment without demands or expectations. "It's beautiful here," she said finally. "I can see why you've stayed." "It suits me," Richard agreed. "How are things in Boston?" "Good, challenging in the right ways. I've taken a different position at the firm, less pressure, more meaningful work. Greg's consulting business is growing steadily. Michael's thriving in his new school." She hesitated. "We're doing well as a family, building something healthier than what we had before." Richard nodded, pleased by this report. "Dad, there's something I wanted to discuss with you, if you're open to it." Emily's tone was cautious, respectful of the boundaries that still existed between them. "I'm listening." "Greg has been offered a teaching position at the University of Maine beginning this fall. It would mean relocating to Bangor." Richard set his mug down slowly. "Bangor is only about an hour from here." "Yes," Emily met his gaze directly. "It wasn't the only factor in our decision, but I won't pretend it wasn't significant. Being closer to you, giving Michael more regular access to his grandfather, these considerations matter to us. And you, what would this move mean for your career?" "I can transfer to our Portland office and work partially remote. It's a step back in terms of prestige, but that's no longer my priority." A small smile played at the corner of her mouth. "I've discovered there are more important measures of success than corner offices and impressive titles." Richard considered this development carefully. The prospect of having his family nearby stirred complex emotions, hope certainly, but also caution. They had made significant progress in healing their relationship, but proximity would bring new challenges. "What are you thinking, Dad?" "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that this could be good. For Michael especially, but for all of us potentially. As long as we continue to respect each other's boundaries, to communicate honestly when issues arise." Emily nodded. "That's what I want too. Not to erase the past or pretend it didn't happen, but to build something new and better on the lessons we've learned." They spent the rest of the morning walking along the shore, talking more freely than they had in years. Emily shared insights from her ongoing therapy, reflections on her marriage, stories about Michael's latest adventures. Richard spoke of his woodworking, his new friends, his gradual discovery of joy in unexpected places. As Emily prepared to leave, she hesitated by her car. "There's one more thing I wanted to tell you. I've been volunteering at a senior center in Boston, helping residents with technology skills. It started as part of my therapy, a way to challenge my ageist assumptions, to connect with older adults as individuals with value and wisdom, rather than as burdens." The admission touched Richard deeply. This tangible evidence of Emily's commitment to change, to addressing the very prejudices that had contributed to her treatment of him, spoke volumes about the sincerity of her transformation. "I'm proud of you, Emily," he said simply. "That can't have been easy." "It's been humbling and illuminating." She smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reminded him of the girl she had once been. "Thank you for today, for listening, for sharing your beautiful home with me. Drive safely. Let me know when you reach Portland." After Emily's departure, Richard returned to his garden, methodically preparing the soil for new growth. The parallels were not lost on him: the careful tending, the patience required, the faith that seeds planted with attention and care would eventually bear fruit. The summer brought the Hayes family's move to Bangor and a new rhythm to Richard's life. Michael spent weekends with him regularly, learning woodworking skills in the workshop and exploring the coastline. Greg and Emily visited occasionally, always respectful of his space while gradually rebuilding comfortable familiarity. On a warm August evening, as Richard sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, he found himself reflecting on the journey of the past year. The pain had not disappeared entirely. Such wounds never heal without leaving marks. But it had transformed into something different, something that carried wisdom rather than bitterness. He thought of Margaret, of what she would make of all that had transpired. He could almost hear her voice on the evening breeze. You did what was necessary, Richard. You stood for your dignity when it mattered most. And in doing so, you taught our daughter the most important lesson of her life. The setting sun cast long shadows across his garden where late summer vegetables grew in neat rows. In the distance, a lobster boat made its way back to harbor, its running lights glimmering against the darkening water. Richard breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the salt-tinged air. This was not the retirement he had imagined all those years ago, as he built a house with his own hands pouring love and hope into every nail and beam. It was something different, something unexpected, and in its own way equally valuable. A life rebuilt not from obligation or habit, but from choice and purpose. In the end, what mattered most was not the house he had built and lost, but the foundations that remained of character, of dignity, of love that endured even when tested by fire. These were the true structures of a life well lived, the legacy he would eventually leave behind. As darkness settled over the Maine coastline, Richard Anderson felt at peace. Not the simple peace he had once envisioned, but a deeper, more nuanced tranquility born of difficulty overcome and wisdom hard won. He had stood for his dignity when it mattered most, and in that standing, he had not only preserved himself, but had helped forge a path toward healing for his entire family. That he decided as the first stars appeared overhead was worth more than any house could ever be.